Most of us know Judas as the betrayer of Jesus, the one disciple who essentially stabbed him in the back and sold him out for 30 pieces of silver, no less. His name doesn't exactly inspire pride or humility. Instead, it's often used as an insult to suggest treachery, deception, and low moral character. According to the Bible, Judas simply wasn't a good person. He's naturally vilified and detested. And while betrayal and disloyalty are central to his character, they're about as deep as it goes. So why am I talking about Judas being a vampire? Well, during my research for new topics, I came across an early 20th century text titled The Vampire, His Kith and Kin, written by English author and clergyman Montague Summers. The book explores various mythologies and folklore surrounding the phenomenon of vampires. In one particular legend, Summers describes a secretive cult living in the regions of Serbia and Romania. This group referred to themselves as actual vampires and went by the name the Children of Judas. They supposedly descended from a vampiric bloodline that traced all the way back to Judas himself. But unlike Judas, these people were arguably even worse, for they would drain their victims of blood with a bite. At first glance, I assumed that if these Children of Judas really did exist, they chose the name for shock value, to amplify their own sinister identity by associating with the betrayer of Christ. After all, there's no indication in the Bible that Judas was a vampire, or even that he had children, so the name seemed like an attention-grabbing title at best. But then I came across whispers of another text, a supposed 9th century manuscript, said to be written in Aramaic, the language believed to have been spoken by Jesus himself. This text, known as the Book of Aluga, is believed to have been authored by a Catholic monk named Ed. Unfortunately, the book is notoriously difficult to find. In fact, I'm not even convinced it truly exists. A quick online search will lead you to a handful of articles claiming Judas was turned into a vampire as punishment for his betrayal. But none of them offer direct quotes or any real analysis of what the book actually says. That leads me to believe that this so-called Book of Aluga is probably just a very niche internet hoax that never really caught on. Even so, it's surprising how many people refer to it as if it were a legitimate historical document. With that in mind, this alleged book has generated a kind of mythology of its own. Some people debate whether it exists at all. Others question the way it portrays Judas becoming a living vampire. Now, the idea that God would turn Judas into a vampire is pretty random. I could understand a punishment that involves wandering the earth, like Cain's punishment in Genesis, or the medieval tale of the wandering Jew. But giving a vampiric twist? That feels like something straight out of a fantasy novel. If the idea sounds familiar, it might be because it mirrors the plot of the movie Dracula 2000, where Judas is cursed by God and becomes Dracula after failing to hang himself. In any case, with the very limited and questionable material we have to work with, let's explore the strange idea of Judas as a vampire and see if we can find any parallels between the elusive Book of Aluga and the scriptures themselves. So, where the concept of Judas becoming a vampire comes from is pretty hard to say. According to online sources, the Book of Aluga is fairly explicit in claiming that Judas became a vampire after he took his own life. The story goes that God was so enraged by Judas' deception that he cursed him with this dark and dreadful burden. Again, since no credible source has ever verified or quoted the book directly, the story should be taken with a hefty grain of salt. Still, the supposed narrative is fascinating. It claims that God told Judas he would forever fear the sun and the light of day, and that because of this curse, he was doomed to roam only in the night. To survive, he would need to feed on the blood of living humans. This was said to be the only sustenance he'd be allowed to consume. One version of the tale even suggests that God knew Judas would have descendants, and that they too would inherit the curse. These offspring, like Judas, would be creatures of the night, sustained only by blood. Another recurring theme in these accounts is that Judas developed an intense aversion to silver, to the cross, and to Christians themselves. This leads to an interesting overlap with later vampire lore. It's tempting to retroactively attach these folkloric elements to the tale of Judas in order to give the story more legitimacy. For instance, the detail that Judas was paid in silver, and that he later tried to rid himself of that silver. could be used to explain why silver came to repel vampires. Likewise, the crucifix, used today as a symbol of spiritual protection, could be linked to Judas' guilt over Jesus' crucifixion. It would be natural for the cross to become a powerful emblem of fear and shame for him and his so-called bloodline. By this logic, the crucifix would serve as more than just a holy icon. It would be a deeply personal reminder of the sin that cursed him forever. The claim that God transformed Judas and his offspring into vampires doesn't just stray from the Gospel of Matthew. It clashes entirely with the moral and theological logic of the Bible. If vampires are condemned to feed on the blood of the innocent to survive, then God's punishment of Judas looks less like justice and more like empowerment. Instead of shutting down his betrayal, it turns him into a nightmarish immortal with an endless thirst for violence. Judas isn't just cast out, he's upgraded into a mass-murdering monster. We do have the biblical account of Cain, who was cursed to wander the earth. But even Cain wasn't transformed into something other than human. He wasn't made dangerous to others in the way that Judas supposedly was. And then there's the issue of Judas being the first vampire. The problem? Vampiric myths go back long before Judas walked the earth. In ancient Babylon, there were tales of spirits called Lilitu, who drank the blood of infants. These weren't vampires as we think of them today, but they were certainly creatures of the night. They weren't afraid of sunlight, and there's no evidence that silver could harm them. So Judas couldn't have been the first vampire. You could argue he was the first of a new era of vampires. But even then, the modern image of the vampire didn't emerge until the 19th century, especially with Bram Stoker's Dracula. So, where does it all leave us? The idea of Judas becoming a vampire makes for a haunting story, sure, but when we examine it under the light of scripture, historical folklore, and theological reasoning, it quickly begins to unravel. The pieces don't quite fit. The premise relies heavily on shaky texts, folkloric tropes, and theological leaps that the Bible itself doesn't support. Yes, it's a compelling image, the ultimate betrayer condemned not to die, but to live forever in darkness, cursed with an unholy thirst. And there's something about that imagery that speaks to deeper themes of guilt, punishment, and the fear of divine rejection. But taken literally, it's a narrative stitched together from fragments of unrelated myths, a few historical superstitions, and some literary flair. A legend, not a doctrine. A story, not a scripture. Without a verified, authentic copy of the elusive Book of Aluga, and no credible evidence that a Catholic monk named Ed ever existed, it's difficult to take this story seriously. At best, it feels like dark theological fanfiction, and as many will probably point out, it sounds suspiciously similar to the plot of Dracula 2000, where Judas becomes a vampire as punishment for his role in the death of the Messiah. Still, it makes for a fascinating thought experiment and a rich blend of mythology, folklore, and speculative theology. If you got thoughts or theories of your own, feel free to share them down in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And as always, if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to give this video a like and subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.